King Jr. I published 6 books on Dr. King, edited 2, co-edited 2, and co-authored 2 for a total of 12, 13 books on Dr. King, but primarily interested in black church studies, Martin Luther King Jr.
Very good. And so, Dr. Baldwin, let's think in terms of the civil rights organizations, and I think that you will admit that we really didn't have African Americans, civil rights organizations for African Americans during the period of slavery.
Exactly.
Now, there were some protesters against slavery, African protesters, but in terms of being organized in order to advance the African American situation, that came after slavery. And so why don't you start out by simply giving us a chronicle of the various civil rights organizations in the United States, how they came into being and how they dissipated and et cetera between now and the end of the show for today.
Obviously, we have to begin with the idea that civil rights organizations are really a 20th century phenomenon. You have to begin with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was founded in New York in 1909 by W.E.B. Du Bois and Mary White Ovington and Ida B. Wells and others. And we know that when the NAACP was founded in 1909, it was designed to fight for the full human rights of African Americans, political, economic, social, educational, and otherwise. And after the NAACP was founded in 1909, 1910, you get the founding of the National Urban League, which was concerned about development of the economic empowerment and economic self-sufficiency in the black community. And we're talking about the early years of the 20th century when you had the Great Depression and other challenges that confronted the African American community at that time. So after 1910, the founding of the Urban League, 1942, you get the founding of the Congress of Racial Equality, which was also designed to fight for the full human rights and civil rights of African Americans. 1957, you get the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. 1960, you get Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
And so what we'll do, we'll stop for our first commercial break and then pick up after that. We'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Louis Baldwin, and he's given us some information in reference to the rise and fall of civil rights organizations in the United States. And we say the rise and fall, Dr. Baldwin, because we want to understand that they came out of somewhere and they fell.
Yes,
and they
some of them did.
That's why they didn't all fall to the same degree, but they're not in the same esteem in a real sense as they were earlier.
Not held in the same esteem.
And so you'll have to explain that for us as well.
Yes, now we know, and I referred earlier to NAACP, Urban League, CORE, SNCC, Student Nonviolent, and of course SCLC. You look at what has happened to those organizations since the 1950s and 60s, when they were involved in sit-ins and freedom rides, the March on Washington, local civil rights campaigns. All of these organizations at points in the 1950s and 60s were able to connect and to pool their resources to develop and launch certain civil rights campaigns. But if you look at what has happened since the 1960s, take for an example the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It became extinct in 1976. Some of the members ended up being a part of the Black Panther Party It rejected the nonviolence of Dr. King, of course, and of course there was FBI infiltration and suppression, which led to the fall of SNCC. Now the other organizations, NAACP, Urban League, CORE, SCLC, are pretty much still surviving, but they are meeting a lot of challenges in terms of fundraising, in terms of stable, effective leadership. Look, for an example, at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which Dr. King and his and a number of ministers founded in Atlanta in 1957. Since Dr. King's death, you've had several chairmen, national presidents of SCLC. You take one example, Fred Shuttlesworth, who was selected in 2004, really didn't finish that year out. And Dr. King's daughter, Bernice King, Reverend Bernice King, was elected to be the president of SCLC. She ended up stepping down before she even took the position. So you're talking about certainly the fall of SNCC, the fact that it has become extinct, but you're looking at other civil rights organizations that are struggling because of lack of funds, struggling because of the lack of stable, effective leadership. And also there's a sense in much of the society that these organizations have outlived their relevance, they've outlived their usefulness, that somehow or another they are anachronisms. But when we look at the climate of the country today, in terms of race relations, we know that these organizations still have some relevance, and it's just a matter of people supporting them and them developing a new vision that is consistent with 21st century realities.
In other words, the population is still there.
Yeah.
But these organizations are not developing programs and plans.
Some of them are, yes. The demographics are there, but the problem is, of course, that you're not getting the support for these organizations that you need. For an example, SCLC. You can talk about the lack of stable, effective leadership, but also the lack of a vision. What is the vision for SCLC beyond Martin Luther King Jr.? That has been a struggle for years, for the last half century. If you look at the NAACP, of course, you got Derrick Johnson as the president of the NAACP now. That organization is pretty strong, but it has gone also through periods when there were challenges around fundraising and effective leadership. You look at CORE, you look at the Urban League, people don't talk about these organizations anymore. They are still there. They have affiliate organizations throughout the country. But I think the problem is that too many of us feel that there's no longer a need
for such organizations.
For these kinds of organizations. But we know differently now in the last couple of years with the forces of Trumpism taking over the country, that there is indeed.
As a matter of fact, there's a greater need if we're going to talk about the participation of African Americans in the political process, the voting, more than anything. I think that if we had an organization that could really get people out to vote. You know, if all of them decided to put all of their efforts simply on what? The vote. And then I think that we would really be powerful.
And the NAACP is doing that, and you take Al Sharpton's National Action Network, which was founded in 1991, is your most recent major black civil rights organization. There are efforts at voter registration. There are efforts to deal with voter suppression and voter intimidation. There are efforts to deal with police brutality and the challenges that African Americans are facing with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. So I don't want to give them the impression that nothing is being done, because these civil rights organizations are functional to some extent, but I think they can be more involved. The other problem, of course, is that you are getting challenges from the rise of civil rights organizations outside of the black community. You have anti-bullying organizations. You have LGBT political advocacy organizations. You have political advocacy organizations for women. So no longer should we speak in terms of black civil rights organizations or biracial civil rights organizations. you have to understand that civil rights organizations exist today for Hispanics. They exist for gay and lesbian groups. They exist for Asian Americans, Jewish Americans. So, and all of these organizations, I think, speak to the legacy of the civil rights movement.
That's
because
exactly
it started there.
That's exactly
and
it.
you can't understand these new civil rights organizations apart from what was happening with the NAACP and SNCC and CORE and the National Urban League.
Very good. And so it's still important for not only African Americans, but for all people to understand that these organizations are playing a very, very important part in terms of the constitutional situation for all people.
All Americans. They're talking about full human and civil rights for all people, irrespective of race, irrespective of religion, political differences, and that's the importance of, I think there's no greater need in history than today for these kinds of civil rights organizations, because we're facing problems with immigrations and what to do with immigrants, what to do with Muslims in light of the Muslim ban, what's to do with people from Central America. So civil rights organizations are very important.
Okay, so what we'll do, we'll take our second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's given us some information in reference to the rise and decline of the civil rights organizations in the United States. I think we may call it the rise and decline, Dr. Baldwin, because as you've indicated that they are still there.
But they've declined in the public imagination.
That's right. And so what we're trying to do is to at least encourage people to do more in reference to them and to find out more about them, because it's still important that they have, well, they still exist.
They have an important role in assuring the continuation of our democratic norms, our democratic traditions, because you can't have democracy without these kinds of organizations fighting. Now, what I think should happen in the future is this. I think we have to reestablish a lot of these organizations on a stronger footing in terms of financial support, in terms of supporting strong, progressive, effective leadership. But I also think that we have to think in terms of partnerships between the established black civil rights organizations and other civil rights organizations, those representing LGBTQ people, those representing the anti-bullying component of society, Jews, women. There has to be some way of establishing partnerships between these organizations, because they are all concerned about civil rights.
And they're all human concerns.
Exactly.
So these are all organizations, they're civil rights organizations, but whatever they might be called, they're all concerned about the human condition.
Yeah, the human condition and the fact that constitutional civil rights of all people should be respected, and also the human rights of people should be respected. And I think that's the importance of what I mean when I say that there have to be these partnerships. And I think the NAACP is taking that into account, because in some cases it has established partnerships with LGBTQ political advocacy groups. Other black civil rights movements have been pressed, organizations rather, have been pressed around that issue as well. So that's the future. If we don't look toward the future in terms of the partnerships that we can establish between various civil rights organizations, then I would say we don't have much of a future in terms of the fight for civil rights and the fight for human rights.
Well, how does the political party fit into how these organizations operate?
Well, I think one of the problems we have is that on the Republican side is that you don't get a lot of support for civil rights organizations. When you talk about civil rights organizations, you're talking primarily about Democratic Party supported organizations. The Republican Party is not known for strong support for NAACP and CORE and Urban League and these political advocacy groups for LGBTQ and women. We need universal support, so to speak, from the larger American society for these organizations, because they speak to what? Our vision of making America truly
great
democratic
again.
And truly great again.
That's it. We can make America great
exactly.
again.
Exactly. We talk about the struggle for human rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can't have that without these organizations, because there are always segments of society that are oppressed because of color, because of religion, because of national background. And I think these civil rights organizations, this is what they are targeting when they talk about the need to make America truly democratic and truly inclusive of all people, irrespective of race and color, religion, national origin, politics, etc.
Well, Dr. Baldwin, I think we've been involved in this kind of discussion over the last 25 or 30 years.
Absolutely.
And I think that the question can be asked, have we been wasting our time?
Yeah, that's a question, but I don't think so. I think we have to understand, and certainly we know, that we have made progress since the civil rights movement. Civil rights organizations have been a major part of that progress, and I think that will continue in the future. We're looking toward the 2020 presidential election, and I think these civil rights organizations will play a major role.
Very good.
In getting people registered to vote. We know that in the 1960s, take SNCC for an example, voter registration was primarily a primary agenda, part of their primary agenda. Going into black communities, launching grassroots efforts to register people to vote and to get them to the polls. I think you'll see that in 2020 with not only groups like the NAACP, but you'll see that with civil rights movements outside of the black community. You'll see it with CORE, you'll see it with Urban League, you'll see it with the National Action Network of Dr. Al Sharpton. So I'm very hopeful about the future in terms of the survival of these organizations and the pivotal role that they will play in not only advancing the civil and human rights of people, but getting people more toward the goal of economic empowerment and economic self-sufficiency.
Yeah, there's a lot to be done.
Yes.
And I think that, and as you said, we've come a long way.
Yeah.
But they say we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.
Yes.
In order that we might be able to truly recognize that we have a democratic society and that in a real sense all men and women are created equal in the society in which we live. That's
and we need to get beyond this idea that civil rights organizations have outlived their relevance.
Oh, yes.
That they've outlived their usefulness, that they are anachronisms, because that's not true. We need them as much today as we did in the 1950s and 60s.
The needs are still the same.
The needs are the same, and in many ways it's a more pressing need for these kind of organizations, given what's happening with immigrants today and people of color today, Muslims who are targeted in our society today for violence and that kind of thing. We know about the burning of the black churches in Louisiana a couple of weeks ago. Hey, we saw that in the late 19th century. We saw it in the 50s and 60s.
Nothing has changed.
Yeah, so the more things change, the more they remain the same. And thus the need for what? Civil rights organizations to make sure that we are a society that respects, that honors, that affirms the civil and human rights of all people.
these are organizations that have been important and will continue to be
Will it
play an
continue?
important role.
Yes, I don't see any point at this point. I don't see
Anything
where.
that could replace them. I mean, what would you, if they were not there, what would there be?
Yeah, we'd be in big trouble. The only problem now is that we need to get people to realize that they are still relevant and to launch efforts to support these groups and to be a part of them and to adopt their vision and understand that our future depends on how we implement that vision and how we fulfill that vision of a totally democratic society that is rooted in participatory democracy.
If we could get the right for every individual to vote in America, then I think that every individual of age and et cetera, the right to vote. I think that should be the central consideration of all of these organizations, no matter how they might be organized or whatever.
And I think it will be. I think it will be because I think people realize that the 2020 elections coming up are very important and that they may determine where we go in the future.
Either
whether
move
or not
forward or backward.
we'll see a future that involves victory and triumph, or whether we'll move down a dark alley of defeat. And I think that's important.
And each of us have the ability to be able to make that decision. And all we have to do is to be able to make it in our own mind.
Exactly.
Each person has to make an individual statement in reference to how he or she stands in reference to our African American voter participation or general voter participation, et cetera.
And we can do that through our support for civil rights.
Civil rights organizations.
Of every kind, not just in the black community, but civil rights organizations that represent different demographics or segments of the society. LGBTQ people, women, Asians, Hispanics, we all have a role in those kinds of civil rights organizations.
And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let me thank you for that excellent information. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.
Who all you got in? I saw Allen, the fellow with the homeless.
Yeah, Howard Allen.
Yeah, Howard Allen. Yeah, I know Howard. Yeah, and we've been having discussions of Dr. Bradley over at the Pitt Library in the J.C. Napier community, and it's going good. The guy, the librarian, is a minister, and he's a Congolese, Congolese, something like that, and he wants to know more about African American history. He's mostly been interacting with whites here. He's a minister at that Park Avenue Baptist Church, and so he is a minister, very educated. And so he's been having different ones of us to make presentations. We got an airplane pilot there who flew Phantom jets, 3 of them in 1968 in Vietnam. You know, yeah, man, he is keen. I'm telling you. And when we be talking, I had to tell him, I said, man, now before you became a pilot, what were you doing? I said, you can help me to understand you better when you start there. Yeah, you know, he got, okay. Give me make it.
No, I got a cramp.
Okay.
I've been sitting up there for the last 3 hours.
Wow, man, you need to take a step. How's your family, Dr. Haney? Yeah, that's good, that's good. Yeah. I've been doing a lot of study over at TSU. You get out there much now? I said I've been doing a lot of studying over at TSU. They got a pretty good library over there. Yeah. There was a book I was supposed to look up.
Okay, so Reconstruction, Reparation,
Right.
and
Reclamation, right.
Okay.
And reclamation, you know, it basically has to do with the water and the land and coal being dug out, put back in. But I believe that that principle also needs to be, the term directional. I think all 3 of those ideas can be applied to different people. Yeah, that's what it is, I'm thinking.
Yeah, that would be a good topic to deal with. Reconstruction, reclamation,
Yeah,
and reconstruction, reparation.
and reclamation.
Should black folks be paid for slavery?
Right.
That's reparation.
Reparation. And the reclamation, how do you interpret reclamation, Dr. Haney?
Reclamation is to reclaim something.
To put in where something been taken out.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
What was there
Yeah.
is gone now.
Right.
And what we need to do is to
Put back.
reclaim it. Yeah.
That's right. And see, that's why I'm all right. That's why I'm saying.
Reclaim.
That's right.
nation.
That's right. Yes, right.
Reparations. Well, you know.
It's different time periods there.
Yeah, because there was no need for reparations before the end of slavery.
Right.
See,
That's right.
That's what reparations is all about.
That's right.
Reparations simply say that black man been slaves
Yeah.
for 200 years.
That's right.
So, and the wealth that they produced, they did not receive
That's right.
any of it.
That's right. That's right.
So now what you're saying is that after 200 years, Africans want to be what? Paid for slavery.
Yeah.
You know,
And see-
for their enslavement. So that's reparation.
But now, and how do you explain this, Dr. Haney? Now, when my father, who went into the CCC during the Depression, and when he come out of the Depression, his property had been misplaced by his people. And then when he came then the war started before he got back. He went in 39, the war started in 42. And so when he got out of the war and got back, there was a mishandling of his inheritance in terms of the property. And so since he'd been in the war, we found out that he was affected by both of the bombs. The family is suffering from ionizing radiation. And so what I'm saying here is in terms of reclamation, there's a reclamation come, you take the Japanese, they're starting to help in the area of reclamation, you know, as a result of the war. So I see 2 categories here. And the time period is the key. that one time period don't go back as far as the other. You know.
No, I mean, they have to be, you couldn't have any reparations
Right.
without the Civil War.
That's right.
Which is to say, without slavery.
Without slavery,
There is
that's
no
right.
reparation
That's
without
right.
slavery.
That's right.
The purpose of reparation is to get paid for
It's like
for being involved
slave,
in slavery.
right? And see, Dr. Haney, that's where I see the wealthy blacks, especially the music industry, all these multi-billionaires, multi-billionaires, I see them as an important part of that reclamation, you know, going back before, reclamation going back before the,
So hold that. So
okay. Oh, yeah.
up here.
Gotcha.
Because I think what I want to try to do is get off this leg.
Okay.
Caught that cramp.
Okay.
How you doing today? You caught a cramp.
Hey. Okay.
Okay. So what we're going to call this reconstruction, reparations, and reclamation.
The 3 R's, I guess, something like that.
Reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Yeah, that's right.
Reconstruction. Of course, what we have to do first is to deal with the Reconstruction period. And that was a period immediately after the war and lasted from 1865. Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. Excuse me. The topic this morning is Reconstruction, Reparations, and Reclamation. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the 3 R's in terms of the African American experience, Minister Gregory Taylor. And of course, Gregory, let me welcome you, Minister Taylor, to the show this morning and to tell you how delighted we are to have you and to think in terms of the topic that you are to deal with this morning, and that is the idea of Reconstruction.
Yes.
That is that period after the Civil War between 1865 and 1876.
Yes, sir.
And one of the issues in reference to the Reconstruction period is that it was a recognition that the southern states that had attempted to withdraw from the Union had fought a war with the northern states, and that war came to an end in 1865, but which ended up with northern troops being placed in the South.
Yes.
In order to what? Reconstruct
That's right.
the southern parts of the United States.
That's
and of
right.
course, out of that came this great desire on the part of many Africans to be paid
That's
for
right.
the slavery that they had been involved in for the last 400 years, and that became known as reparation.
That's right.
And of course, I think that you are now introducing into this 3rd R,
Yes.
and that is reclamation.
Yes,
and
sir.
so what we'd like to do is to have you to give us some information in reference to your background,
Yes.
education, and some of your experiences, and then we'll start doing the 2nd segment of the show.
Yes, sir.
8 minutes.
Yes.
And we'll start talking about Reconstruction period, the efforts at reclaiming, reclamation, and reparations.
Yes.
And then the efforts following that period, the period of reclamation. And I think that you've sort of added that to one of the 2 R's that we often talk about. Let's talk about, give you an opportunity to say something about your background, education, and experiences, and then we'll get into a discussion of the 3 R's.
Yes, sir.
Reconstruction, reparation, and reclamation.
Yes, sir.
Let's do it from that perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Haney, and I'm thankful to be back. And also, I want to start out by acknowledging our president of the country, and also is that yours or mine?
I think that might be yours. Because mine is over there.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Ain't this something? That postman had this on me. We're not being carded.
We have.
We being recorded?
Okay.
Let me get this.
I wish I had known that.
I didn't know. Shucks.
Where is it? I mean,
I don't
it's some kind of buzz you got.
It's something on the phone, but I can't find the phone. Oh, that's what it was. It was the watch.
Oh,
Let me take it off. Yeah, it was the watch.
Yeah.
Let me see.
Well, don't put it anywhere where it might go off again.
No, I won't put it out there somewhere. Sorry about that. Okay.
So we're gonna have to start that all over, right?
Sorry about that, Doctor.
Yeah.
I ain't that technical. These sound things.
Well, we have to start all over. And so.
And I forgot to check my equipment.
Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the 3 R's in the African American experience, and those 3 R's are Reconstruction, Reparation, and Reclamation. And we have with us to talk about the 3 R's generally associated with the African American during the period after slavery, Minister Gregory Taylor. And of course, Minister Taylor, let me welcome you to the show this morning and tell you how delighted we are to have you and to talk about the so-called 3 R's in the African American experience, dealing with the status of Africans in the United States. And of course, that would be Reconstruction, which is a period immediately after the end of the Civil War that lasts from 1865 down through 1876. It is said at that particular time that the end of the war, the South has been what? Reconstructed, and so primarily that is what we mean when we talk about what? Reconstruction. But the new idea is reparation. And of course, reparation means that Africans wanted to be paid for the efforts that they had given during the period of slavery. And of course, there was a great movement that became known as the movement for reparations.
Yes, sir.
And finally, we talk about reclamation, and I think that you've sort of added that to our discussion. And we'll give you an opportunity to talk about reclamation
That's
during
right.
this period.
That's right.
So let's talk about Minister Taylor for the next few minutes.
Yes, sir.
During this segment, and I have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of your experiences.
Yes.
And then during the second period, we will have an opportunity to get into the reconstruction, reparations, and reclamation
Yes,
of African Americans.
Thank you, Dr. Haney, and I'm delighted to be back. And as I was saying first, I must acknowledge the president of the country, President Donald J. Trump, as well as the governor of this state. And I never met either one of them, but this morning when I left my apartment, there was a young man at the door down in the hall, and he was knocking on the door, and the man come out, and he said, you on time. And what was so intriguing about it, he worked with the Lee Company. He was a plumber. So we got on the elevator together, and I discovered those things about him. I let him know I was a plumber too, coming from a plumbing background. But I'm saying all that to say, I've met this governor through his work and how he's named in the country, in this state, in this kind of thing, how he's recognized, and I appreciate all of that. And the other thing here is I am an ambassador for the Civilian Conservation Corps. My father was one, I'm one today. The men in the Conservation Corps were credited with General George C. Marshall at their training with what won World War II. And I am honored to know that my father was among those men. And so we are carrying these things on. It's like a totem pole. And here in Nashville, I am a member of the Corinthian Church with the Reverend Enoch Fuzz. And he used to introduce me when he was on the radio and I was in Atlanta and this type of thing. And the reason I'm expressing all of these individuals, to me, this is a form of reclamation. I am mentioning others who have made the way for me to be here today. So it is in order for me to mention them in the ways in which I have, leading up to saying the things that I come to share with today.
Very good.
Yes.
Very good. And so let's make some statements during the next minute and a half in reference to background education, that kind of thing. Sort of summarize that up for us.
Sir.
And then we'll go into this second segment talking about the 3 R's.
Yes.
That we're talking about.
Well, my background in education, I am a graduate of Selma University. I went to Tuscaloosa County High School in Northport, Alabama, Matthews Elementary, and went to kindergarten where I quit. I was afraid of the teacher's voice, so I quit kindergarten. My mother let me quit kindergarten. And during that time, I began to think of ways in order to try to educate myself. And then when you grow up and you come from a very protected family, you've given a lot, you begin to become dependent on those things, and you don't spend a lot of time developing the skills necessary to help yourself, in this kind of thing. So that's basically, it sums up my education. Had a lot of toys. Most of the guys that I grew up with in my hometown, they remember my toys to this day, because we put the kind of thought into selecting them.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, and so what we will do, we'll take our first commercial break,
Okay.
and then we'll come back and we'll deal with reconstruction, reparations, and reclamation. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
It's 8 minutes, okay?
And so what we want to do is to talk about Reconstruction, the Reconstruction period in American history.
Yes.
And reclamation, reparations, pay us. And then finally, your idea of reclamation.
Okay.
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 Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Minister Taylor, and he's giving us some information in reference to what might be called the 3 R's in the African American social and economic experience, and that is Reconstruction, the period immediately after the war, and reparations, which is to say that Africans wanted to be paid for the work that they had performed during the war, and of course, reclamation. And I think that this is something that you've added to the R's, and we'll have you give an explanation as well as a discussion in reference to it. But let's talk about it from that perspective.
And Dr. Haney, the way this happened, last week I think there was a special on recollection by Henry Louis Gates, and I didn't get a chance to see it. But what I did do, I went to the encyclopedia to take a look at the Reconstruction period. And this just happened last week. And I discovered the Bureau of Reclamation. And so that really incited me, because I have written President Trump several times, and I have asked for a kind of a tax, a MLK Reclamation Tax Fund. And this is designed to speak to all of the African Americans who have profited from the MLK Civil Rights Movement. Now, my life is the best one to show how the side effects of the Civil Rights Movement has never been addressed, Dr. Haney. Though African Americans who have profited from it, they don't have a memory of not profiting from it. But see, I have that memory, and in my hometown of Selma, at Selma University, Dr. C.C. Vivian, he told me that when they left Selma in the 60s, they didn't look back. A lot of places that they've been and were in these cities, and I have done the research. My life is a counter-narrative of that period, and it's the best life, I believe, to break down, to show how the wealthy blacks who have profited from the Civil Rights Movement should be the ones to contribute to the reclamation fund, tax fund. And see, it's like a domino effect, Dr. Haney. You go back to Reconstruction, and then when you had the Civil Rights Movement, then you go back to Reconstruction. But see, the ones who've been in the Civil Rights Movement, they have never taken the time out to see the damage left there. And take, for instance, the book by Eddie Taylor in Chicago called Restoring the Mind of Black America. He explains how when the Malcolm X life came to an end, MLK and the Black Panthers, he explained how their lives were not properly mourned, and it has spiraled down into poverty, lack of education, teenage pregnancy, and all of these things. So I can't look over those things, directly into the Civil Rights era and then going back to Reconstruction, because I think reclamation, and like you take coal out of the ground, you're supposed to put something back in. And as I've said before, I know how to show the African Americans what it is that has been taken out of our community. The music, when they rewrote the old songs of the church, which Du Bois say is the greatest gift that the Negro has given to America. And on the radio in Chicago last Monday on the Mark Wallace show, he expressed that he asked his mother, was she listening to MLK speeches when she was pregnant with him? And she told him that she was. So what am I saying, Dr. Haney? The children who were before the movement and who were in prenatal, they have been preconditioned because his voice is embryonic. It has affected them in that period. So once they are born, they are prepared for Congressman John Lewis to take them into the movement or this kind of thing. So I'm just saying I have to get this out because, see, my father lost everything as a result of the movement. So that's
well, now, in a real sense, if you're going to talk about the Reconstruction,
yeah, yes, sir.
What you have to do is to understand what this did in terms of liberating some 4.5 million Africans from slavery. And so that's important.
Yes.
And then to recognize that after they are liberated, they are without any kind of resources in a real sense. It was against the law for Africans to own property, to be married, and all of these restrictions.
That's right.
But Reconstruction allowed Africans to receive the most important thing, and that is what? The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave black folks freedom.
Yes.
The 14th Amendment to the Constitution,
that's right,
which also gave Africans the right to vote, to make them human.
That's right.
So these are what we call the Human Rights Amendments.
That's right.
And of course the 15th Amendment, which is the right to vote.
Yes.
Now these were three important things that came to the African population during the period immediately after slavery.
That's right.
But I think one of the greatest challenges was the idea of repayment That is, Africans should be paid for the 400 years of slavery that they endured.
Yes.
Now, of course, nobody's talking about coming out and giving everybody $20 an hour for a long period of time. No, which is to say that, you know, and not to make light of it,
yes.
but what we're saying here is that it is not necessary to talk about any kind of financial compensation in terms of giving everybody $2 or whatever, et cetera.
Okay. Yes.
But it is important to recognize that because of slavery, there were things that were done that inhibited Africans from making the kind of progress that others were able to make. And that is what people mean for the most part when they talk about reparations,
yes,
you
sir.
see, and not any kind of financial thing.
Right.
But I think that people have come up across the nation dealing with all kinds of ideas as to how this idea of reparation should be recognized.
Yes.
And of course, there are many different ideas.
And Dr. Haney, as you were saying, and as I was saying, my life is the best one to show how reclamations, and then it's like a domino. You have reclamation, then you have reparation, then you have the reconstruction. I'm thinking now in moving back, not back there. I can't go back there, but I'm just 64 years old. But I remember the civil rights movement. I remember in the 3rd grade when it came to Tuscaloosa, how it disturbed the family in the midst of the development of interpersonal communication. My father worked at Ryco Chemical. My mother was a homemaker. And he had to leave work because one of the sisters was on her way to Stillman College. But the point that we are pointing out here is simply this, that the reclamation takes in account, for example, the National Pride newspaper said after 50 years, there was something that was going on there that had not been addressed in terms of reclamation.
Okay, and so what we'll do, we'll take our first commercial break.
Okay.
And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Segment. This is the second segment.
This is the third.
Yes, the 3rd.
Is this the third segment?
Yeah. This is your last one.
I guess I've been sitting here too long today because I was thinking that this was the end of.
Well, he did the talking, most of the talking.
But we are.
I understand.
Well, I had to keep you on the right
that's
road.
That's right, and you're the historian.
Well, I had to keep you on the right road.
That's right.
Okay, so what?
But it was helpful. You know, you were able to help me to see back in that period. So I can't go back there, you know, and address that, but I can meet you over this way coming up. Yeah.
Max, stand by, Dr. Last segment.
Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Minister Taylor, and the topic is the 3 R's of the African American experience following the Civil War. And I think, Professor Taylor, we've already indicated that one of those experiences was the Reconstruction, the end of the war itself that liberated Africans. And I think we indicated that they were given the 13th Amendment, that slavery ended, the 14th Amendment, the right of citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, the vote.
That's right.
And many people have considered this to be important in terms of the African experience in America.
Yes.
And I think that some have also added, and I think that you've added a 3rd R to it.
That's right.
And you call this reclamation.
That's correct.
And I think that that's important.
Yes.
So we'll give you an opportunity now to evaluate that.
Okay, and Dr. Haney, in reference to reclamation, see, learning to protest and march and all these things, that affected the interpersonal communications in the African American community across the board. And in Selma, when the Civil Rights Movement left Selma, Dr. L. Wilkins, PhD, wrote that it left a schism, a lack of spiritualness, a moral decay, and a confusion that affected the families, the schools, and the churches. And one of my mentors, you say, in Atlanta, Dr. Andrew Harrison, he's a judge. He's also a general in the military, in the Army, and he was in the Atlanta Traffic Court. And he said, when we get in these spaces, we have to deliver. And this is what I'm trying to do, because this has to do with our kids' ability to learn. When I was in the school system, I would ask the kids, I said, why do you make so many sounds that have no meaning? And things of this nature. So, but in the area of the civil rights era, their kids have been affected in their ability to concentrate. And these things they have not been able to put into words. And when the civil rights movement left Selma, Dr. Turner J.L. Chestnut, Auntie said it took the kids a whole year to learn how to concentrate in the classroom again.
Now, in a real sense, Minister Taylor, the idea of reclamation, as you're explaining it
Yes.
now, talk about it within the terms of how it fits into the idea of reconstruction, reparations, and reclamation.
That's right, okay.
Reclaim, what are Africans trying to reclaim?
Okay, right now, English is like our second language. Most of us think it's Swahili or something like that. But right now, we're just trying to learn how to talk and say what we need to talk about that's happening now. And you got all these recordings in black radio. They don't do nothing but play music. You know, I have been trying to get several of them to take 2 or 3 minutes out to explain to the kids encoding, decoding, giving feedback. And when a person is interference prone, they don't even take out the time to do that. You take right now at the Sunday School Publishing Board, the director there of the Sunday School Publishing Board, he's in my debt for $865. We're trying to keep Dr. J. Robert Bradley's legacy alive. His name is in granite down there on the court of 3 stars. The CCC there is also, those are some old men, and it's about maybe 50 of them that is left. The insensitivity of the grandchildren of MLK, these civil rights babies, they are destroying our country. And so this is about the country today for me.
Well, I think that's a point of view.
Yes.
But in terms of reclamation,
yes, sir.
you see, that is, and I thought that your idea was that this is to what? Reclaim.
It is to I start here. The letters that I'm receiving from the president, it's making mentions of restoring the rule of law, and also the restoring the spirit of our nation. Dr. Bradley is the best singer, one of the best singers when it comes to that. He was the favorite singer of MLK. And then you have the restoring the rule of law. And I've even asked the president to use my family to help restore the rule of law in America.
Let's talk about your family in reference to that.
Okay.
Because now, reclamation, when you speak of reclamation,
yes.
How do you place your family within, I mean, what has your family to reclaim?
Well, that's an excellent question there, Dr. Haney. See, I come out of a medical family. I've been to medical school at Emory, Georgia Tech, and Morehouse School of Medicine. I know what the problem is when it comes to communications in the medical profession. All of this is reclamation being reconnected. If you had 2 students who one was graduate BA in English and one was BS in biology, and they wanted to go to medical school, they would accept the one with the BA in English. Why? Because the communications in the medical profession is very bad. You also have hearing loss. I work with Mr. David, what's his name? David, I can't think of his name, but he's with the Let My People Hear organization. It has to do with hearing loss. You have so many different things that are affecting us, and that's why.
Do you feel that that there's quite a bit of misinformation in reference to what people are receiving, or what? I mean, oftentimes you make statements in reference to that people are not receiving the proper kind of information. What kind of information do you believe that people should receive?
Well, one of the main things, and I've heard Bill Cosby say this, that one of the best things that parents can give their children is to see the mother and father, see them talking to each other. I didn't get interpersonal communication skills coming up out of my family. I got them by living in the families of other educators as I was acquiring my education. Dr. Wilson Fallon in Birmingham at the Birmingham Baptist College, he was one who I had the opportunity to live in his home, and he told me whenever I was in Birmingham, I had somewhere to stay. But having the opportunity to just experience that home environment has just been so important. And then you have the interpersonal communication skills. Black radio, they give the impression on the air that they are omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent because of the airtime that they have. But most of them are verbally illiterate. I have been put off 8 radio stations. Why? Because they don't want the people to hear this. Down in Tuscaloosa, WQDZ and WJLD, they're the longest running. They've been on the air since about the end of 45, the war.
Now, does that play into anything in reference to reclamation? I mean, how do you reclaim something that has never been in a real sense?
That's an excellent question, Mr. Dr. Haney. Both of those radio owners was in Birmingham with the Bull Connor and them dogs. And I tell some people that if you put them radio station in a dog pound down in Birmingham, them dogs will bark all day and they'll howl all night because they think they're still back in the civil rights movement. It is those vocals of those radio hosts, it echoes something when they get on the air, that they know how to use it against their own people. And in the reclamation, they also, Reconstruction period, they also had law enforcement officers in order to protect the rights of the people. Today, we need someone to help protect blacks of their rights from these wealthy ones.
Well, I mean, I think that's a point of view.
Oh, well, let me give you another angle on it. I come out of a family where Munchausen syndrome by proxy is 90 years old. I've had a cousin to contact the police department here in Nashville and say I was texting the courts and churches in Birmingham, in Alabama, Tuscaloosa, to shoot them up. I don't even know how to text. Now there's been an officer who has started to investigate. That's Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And when I first moved here and
what do you call that?
Munchausen syndrome by proxy is where a person will concoct things around someone else and get others to believe it, and it's not true. And when I first moved here and met Chief Anderson, I asked him had he ever dealt with it, and he said yes. And that made me...
Well, he understood exactly what you were talking about.
Yes, and that made me comfortable because I've been mentored by the same FBI agent that trained his officers. He mentored me in Atlanta because of the family that I come out of, and my sister, who went to Tennessee State University, named Loretta Johnson, she was on probation as a nurse in Atlanta. She was doing things as a nurse she was not supposed to be doing. So all of these things have got to be brought out. And she was one who was so in love with MLK that she manipulated the family.
Well, see, the thing about it, I think that you mentioned MLK.
Yes.
Oftentimes in reference to this.
Yeah, I do. Because I have chronicled how my life is a counter-narrative of his. And when Dr. Baldwin was here...
When you say that your life is a counter-narrative of the life of Dr. MLK.
Yes.
Explain what that means. Of course, I don't think we have time. I think we'll have to have.
I didn't want to take long.
About 17 seconds.
I could do it.
No, don't try to do it in 17 seconds.
Let me do it, Dr. Haney. It's important.
And of course, we're going to have to end
Okay.
it now. And of course, we're going to thank our audience. And of course, let me encourage you to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.